The expulsion of the Acadians. The expulsion of the Acadians, also known as the Great Upheaval, the Great Expulsion, and Le Grand Dérangement, was the forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from the present-day Canadian maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and area also known as Acadie. The expulsion 1755 to 1764 occurred during the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, and was part of the British military campaign against New France. The British first deported Acadians to the 13 colonies, and after 1758 transported additional Acadians to Britain and France. In all, approximately 11,500 Acadians were deported. After the British conquest of Acadia in 1710, the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht allowed the Acadians to keep their lands. Over the next 45 years, however, the Acadians refused to sign an unconditional oath of allegiance to Britain. I repeat, the Acadians refused to sign an unconditional oath of allegiance to Britain. During the same period, they also participated in various military operations against the British and maintained supply lines to the French fortresses of Louisbourg and Fort Beauséjour. As a result, the British sought to eliminate any future military threat posed by the Acadians and to permanently cut the supply lines they provided to Louisbourg by removing them from the area. Without making distinctions between the Acadians who had been neutral and those who had resisted the occupation of Acadia, the British governor Charles Lawrence and Nova Scotia Council ordered them to be expelled. In the first wave of the expulsion, Acadians were deported to other British colonies. During the second wave, they were deported to Britain and France, from where they migrated to Louisiana. Acadians fled initially to francophone colonies such as Canada, the uncolonized northern part of Acadia, Île Saint-Jean et Île Royale. During the second wave of the expulsion, these Acadians were either imprisoned or deported. Throughout the expulsion, Acadians and the Wabanaki Confederacy continued a guerrilla war against the British in response to British aggression, which had been continuous since 1744, see King George War and Father Le Loutre War. Along with the British achieving their military goals of defeating Louisbourg and weakening the Mikmaq and Acadian militias, the result of the expulsion was the devastation of both a primarily civilian population and the economy of the region. Thousands of Acadians died in the expulsions, many from diseases and drowning when ships were lost. On July 11, 1764, the British government passed an order in council to permit Acadians to legally return to British territories, provided that they make an unqualified oath of allegiance. The American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow memorialized the historic event in this poem about the plight of the fictional character Evangeline, which was popular and made the expulsion well known. According to Acadian historian Maurice Basque, the story of Evangeline continues to influence historic accounts of the deportation, emphasizing neutral Acadians and de-emphasizing those who resisted the British Empire. Historical context. After the British officially gained control of Acadia in 1713, the Acadians refused to sign an unconditional oath of loyalty to become British subjects. Instead, they negotiated a conditional oath that promised neutrality. Some Acadians remained neutral and refused the unconditional oath. The difficulty was partly religious, as the British monarch was the head of the Protestant Church of England, and the Acadians were Roman Catholic. They also worried that signing the oath might commit male Acadians to fight against France during wartime, and that it would be perceived by their Mikmaq neighbors as an acknowledgement of the British claim to Acadia, putting Acadian villages at risk of attack from Mikmaq. Other Acadians refused to sign an unconditional oath because they were anti-British. Various historians have observed that some Acadians were labeled neutral when they were not. By the time of the expulsion of the Acadians, there was already a long history of political and military resistance by Acadians and the Wabanaki Confederacy to the British occupation of Acadia. The Mikmaq and the Acadians were allies through their Catholicism and numerous intermarriages. While the Acadians were the largest population, the Wabanaki Confederacy, particularly the Mikmaq, held the military strength in Acadia even after the British conquest. They resisted the British occupation and were joined on numerous occasions by Acadians. These efforts were often supported and led by French priests in the region. The Wabanaki Confederacy and Acadians fought against the British Empire in 6 wars, including the French and Indian Wars, Father Rail's War, and Father Le Loup Wars, over a period of 75 years. The French and Indian War. In 1753, French troops from Canada marched south and seized and fortified the Ohio Valley. Britain protested the invasion and claimed Ohio for itself. On May 28, 1754, the war began with the Battle of Jumonville Glen. French officer assigned to Jumonville and a third of his escort were killed by a British patrol led by George Washington. In retaliation, the French and the Indians defeated the British at Fort Necessity. Washington lost a third of his force and surrendered. Major General Edward Braddock's troops were defeated in the Battle of Monongahela, and William Johnson's troops stopped the French advance at Lake George. In Acadia, the primarily British objective was to defeat the French fortifications at Beauséjour and Louisbourg and to prevent future attacks from the Wabanaki Confederacy. French and Acadians on the northern New England border. There was a long history of these attacks from Acadia. See the Northeast Coast Campaigns, 1688, 1703, 1723, 1724, 1745, 1746, and 1747. The British saw the Acadians' allegiance to the French and the Wabanaki Confederacy as a military threat. Father Le Loup War was created had created the conditions for total war. British civilians had not been spared, and as Governor Charles Lawrence and the Nova Scotia Council saw it, Acadian civilians had provided intelligence, sanctuary, and logistical support, while others had fought against the British. During the Loup War, to protect the British settlers from attacks along the former border of New England Acadia, the Kennebec River, and British built Fort Halifax, Winslow, Fort Shirley, Dresden, formerly Frankfurt, and Fort Western Augusta. After the British capture of Beauséjour, the plan to capture Louisbourg included cutting trade to the fortress in order to weaken the fortress and in turn weaken the French ability to supply the Mikmaq in their warfare against the British. According to historian Stephen Patterson, more than any other single factor, including the massive assault that eventually forced the surrender of Louisbourg, the supply problem brought an end to French power in the region. Lawrence realized he could reduce the military threat and weaken Fortress Louisbourg by deporting the Acadians, thus cutting off supplies to the fort. During the expulsion, French officer Charles Deschamps de Bois-Hébert led the Mikmaq and the Acadians in a guerrilla war against the British. According to Louisbourg account books, by late 1756, the French had regularly dispensed supply to 700 natives. From 1756 to the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, the French made regular payments to Chief Jean-Baptiste Cope and other natives for British scalps. My goal was just to have the historical context of the Acadian deportation. I will just list the British deportation campaigns. You had the Bay of Fundy, 1755. I will provide the link. It is, in fact, it is a Wikipedia link. Donc, Bay of Fundy, 1755. You have Cape Sable, Île Saint-Jean and Île Royale, Petit Kodiak River Campaign, Saint John River Campaign, Gulf of St. Lawrence Campaign. This interests me, so I will read it. Main article, Gulf of St. Lawrence Campaign, 1758. In the Gulf of St. Lawrence Campaign, also known as the Gaspé Expedition, British forces raided French villages along present-day New Brunswick and the Gaspé Peninsula coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, ou Fleuve Saint-Laurent. Sir Charles Hardy and Brigadier General James Wolfe commanded the naval and military forces respectively. After the siege of Louisbourg, 1758, Wolfe and Hardy led a force of 1,500 troops in 9 vessels to Gaspé Bay, arriving there on September 5th. From there, they dispatched troops to Miramichi Bay on September 12th, Grande Rivière, Quebec, and Pabos on September 13th, and Mont-Louis, Quebec on September 14th. Over the following weeks, Hardy took 4 sloops or schooners, destroyed about 200 fishing vessels, and took about 200 prisoners. Then you have Restigouche, you have Halifax, you have Maine. The deportation destinations, you have, I'm just listing them, Maryland, Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut, Pennsylvania and Virginia, Carolinas, and Georgia. We're talking about, of course, North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, France and Britain, and the fate of Acadians that I won't have the time to read. And also you have the historical comparisons listed, the commemorations also, as well as, of course, the references. I I will put the link in the video description. Thanks for listening. Deported Acadians to the 13 colonies, and after 1758 transported additional Acadians to Britain and France. In all, approximately 11,500 Acadians were deported. After the British conquest of Acadia in 1710, the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht Island, an area also known as Acadia. The expulsion 1755 to 1764 occurred during the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, and was part of the British military campaign against New France. The British first in various military operations against the British and maintained supply lines to the French fortresses of Louisbourg and Fort Beauséjour. As a result, the British sought to eliminate any future military threat posed by the Acadians and to permanently cut the supply lines they provided to Louisbourg by removing them from the area. Allowed the Acadians to keep their lands. Over the next 45 years, however, the Acadians refused to sign an unconditional oath of allegiance to Britain. I repeat, the Acadians refused to sign an unconditional oath of allegiance to Britain. During the same period, they also participated in the expulsion of the Acadians. The expulsion of the Acadians, also known as the Great Upheaval, the Great Expulsion, and Le Grand Dérangement, was the forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from the present-day Canadian maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward